Think back to January 2nd, 1949. The sun rose over the Great Plains like any other winter morning. Pale, distant, indifferent. Farmers in Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming woke to clear skies and bitter cold. The radio promised nothing unusual. Just another cold snap. By midnight, some families would be trapped in their homes, unable to open their doors. Cattle would freeze standing upright. And the drifts, these weren't gentle hillocks. They would reach 25, 30, even 40 feet high, taller than houses. This is the story of the Great Plains blizzard of 1949, one of the most catastrophic winter storms of the 20th century, a weather event so severe it would force an entire nation to rethink how it prepared for winter. The first week of January 1949 had been cold but clear across the central United States. Temperatures ranged from 5 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. It was winter, yes, but nothing that hadn't happened dozens of times before. But here's what the newspapers didn't tell you. The setup for disaster was already in place. In Colorado, a man named Earl Henderson ran a small gas station outside Le Mans. At 53 years old, he'd seen plenty of winters. His wife, Martha, had made coffee that morning. Their 2 teenage sons were getting ready for school. It seemed like any other day. 200 miles north near Gillette, Wyoming, rancher Tom Westbrook was moving cattle between pastures. He'd done this for 40 years. The forecast on his battery-powered radio said cold and clear. He packed extra coffee in his saddlebag. Something about the air felt different, he'd later recall. But different didn't mean dangerous. And in a small farmhouse outside Mitchell, South Dakota, a widow named Sarah Kalinsky was preparing lunch for her 2 grandchildren. At 71 years old, she'd survived the hard winters of the 1880s and 1890s. She had supplies, canned goods, flour, wood for the stove. But none of them understood what was coming. But here's what most people don't realize about forecasting in 1949. Weather predictions extended only 24 to 36 hours ahead with any real confidence. High above the plains, 2 massive air masses were about to collide. From the Arctic, a cold front of incredible intensity was dropping southward. Temperatures in that air mass were running 40 to 50 degrees below zero. Meanwhile, from the Pacific, a powerful low-pressure system was pushing eastward, dragging moisture from the Gulf of Mexico. When these 2 systems met on January 2nd, they collided with tremendous force. The jet stream was positioned perfectly to channel the cold southward. The result was rapid intensification. Meteorologists would later calculate that the pressure drop was extraordinary, from around 29.8 inches in the morning to 28.5 inches by evening. That 1.3-inch drop in just 12 hours told the story. This wasn't a typical winter storm. This was explosive deepening. By 2 p.m. on January the 2nd, the first reports of heavy snow were reaching Omaha. Wind speeds reached 25 to 35 miles per hour, but the real system was still approaching. The wall of snow and wind was racing across Colorado and into Wyoming. Earl Henderson closed the gas station at 4 p.m. when he noticed the sky beginning to change. Blue was turning gray. The wind was picking up. He called his wife. "Martha, I'm heading home. Something's changing." He made it home barely, roads still visible but snow falling heavily. Behind him, the road disappeared. Tom Westbrook was still with his cattle at 5 p.m., moving them toward shelter. He was experienced enough to understand that this cold front had teeth. The temperature was dropping fast. The wind was picking up from the north. He pushed the herd toward the barn. They were moving slower now. The snow was falling thicker. And then something changed. By 6 p.m. on January 2nd, the full force of the storm had arrived. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was flying. Wind speeds had reached 45 to 60 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour. Visibility dropped from miles to a quarter mile, then an eighth of a mile, then to just 50 feet. Drivers leaving Omaha at 5 p.m. found themselves driving through a whiteout wall of horizontal snow. In Grand Island, Nebraska, the temperature was 20 degrees. 1 hour later, it would be 10 below. An hour after that, 30 below. The wind chill was catastrophic. A person exposed outside for more than 10 minutes faced frostbite risk. Exposed for longer than 20 minutes, hypothermia became serious. Exposed for an hour, death became likely. But people were outside. They didn't have a choice. Tom Westbrook made it to his barn with his cattle by 6:30 p.m. But the wind was so fierce that working the barn door was difficult. Once inside, he attempted to walk 200 yards back to his house. He made it 50 yards before he couldn't see. The snow was so thick that his outstretched hand was invisible. He turned around and felt his way back to the barn by following a rope he'd strung. He would spend the night in the barn with his cattle, using their body heat for warmth, rationing 1 thermos of coffee. Earl Henderson's 15-minute drive took 45 minutes. By the time he reached his farmhouse, roads behind him were already impassable. Snow covered his entire body. Martha had the fire stoked and lights on. "How bad is it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "It's bad," he said finally. "Close the doors. We might be here a while." In Mitchell, South Dakota, Sarah Kolinsky was listening to Corn radio when broadcasts became urgent. Travel is not advised. Conditions are rapidly deteriorating. Her grandchildren asked, "When's Mum coming to pick us up?" Sarah's daughter had planned to retrieve them on January 3rd. Sarah looked out into the dark where snow flew almost parallel to the ground. "Not tomorrow, I think," Sarah said. She was already planning. How much fuel for the stove? Enough for 2, maybe 3 days if careful. Food, plenty, water, the well. If this lasted longer, they might have a problem. That's when the reports started coming in from the highways. By 8 p.m. on January 2nd, the system was slowing down. Instead of moving at typical 25 to 35 miles per hour, it was moving at only 10 to 15 miles per hour. This meant that locations weren't experiencing a 12-hour blizzard. They were experiencing 24, 30, even 36 hours of continuous heavy snow and wind. The first highway reports came through around 7 p.m., stranded vehicles on US 34 near Ogallala, Nebraska. By 8 p.m., the Nebraska State Patrol reported multiple jackknifed semi-trucks on I-80. By 9 p.m., every major highway across the northern Great Plains was effectively closed. One driver was a traveling salesman named Robert Castillo. He was in a 1948 Chevy with a full tank of gas. He'd left Cheyenne at 3 p.m., heading for Denver. The forecast had said cold and clear. He thought he'd be back by dinner. By 6 p.m., he was driving through conditions he'd never experienced. The snow flew sideways. His windshield iced over faster than his wipers could clear it. Other cars pulled over, hazard lights flashing. Bob Castillo was from the East Coast. He didn't fully understand Great Plains weather. He thought the car would make it. By 7:30 p.m., somewhere between Cheyenne and Laramie, the radiator froze solid. The engine sputtered. Bob pulled over, trying to stay calm. He was on the highway, well-traveled. Someone would come, a snowplow or patrol officer. He waited. The wind howled. The temperature dropped toward 20 below zero. He ran the engine for 10 minutes, then shut it off to conserve fuel, turning on the heater. On, off, on, off. Hours passed. No one came. The snow totals were becoming staggering. From January 2nd through 4th, the storm dumped between 20 and 50 inches across the northern plains. Wind speeds of 45 to 70 miles per hour took that snow and sculpted it into drifts of impossible height. Fences disappeared completely. Power lines vanished. Roads became indistinguishable from the countryside. Snowplows. One Colorado County farmer's barn had drifts that reached 35 feet high. Another farmer reported a drift that completely covered his 2-story farmhouse except for the chimney. Another reported a main road drift nearly 40 feet high, blocking all access. But here's what most people don't realize. The livestock weren't the only ones dying. The first death was reported on January 3rd. A man in Nebraska trying to walk from his house to his barn, about 200 yards, became disoriented in the whiteout. He was found 3 days later, having walked in a circle, collapsing approximately 30 yards from his house. By January 4th, the death toll was climbing. A woman in South Dakota, a rancher in Wyoming, a sheriff's deputy in Colorado trying to rescue stranded motorists. The common thread: time exposed to elements. Sometimes as little as 20 or 30 minutes. The wind chill index ranged from 40 to 60 below zero, approaching 80 below in extreme conditions. The livestock casualties were staggering. In Wyoming alone, reports estimated that between 40,000 and 60,000 cattle died. In Nebraska, the number exceeded 30,000. In Colorado and South Dakota combined, another 50,000 head of cattle perished. An estimated 100,000 to 150,000 sheep died across the region. The economic impact was catastrophic. A head of cattle in 1949 was worth approximately $50 to $75. Multiply that by roughly 100,000 to 150,000 cattle losses, and livestock losses exceeded $5 to 11 million, equivalent to roughly $65 to $145 million in today's dollars. Tom Westbrook's herd survived the night in the barn, but by January 3rd, he couldn't access food and water. He managed to break through a window and shovel snow to melt for water. 3 of his cattle had already died. Another 7 were critical. Earl Henderson's gas station sustained severe wind damage. The roof partially collapsed. Repairs would cost thousands. The station sat closed for 2 months. Sarah Kalinsky's farmhouse held. The stove kept them warm. Supplies held. But on January 5th, when her daughter finally made it through cleared roads, the roads into the property still hadn't been cleared. Her daughter had to park a mile away and walk the final distance. Standing in the driveway looking at 25-foot drifts, Sarah truly understood the magnitude of what had happened. The power lines were down across an estimated 23,000 square miles of the northern Great Plains. Telephone communication was severed in entire counties. The cost of damage to power and communication infrastructure alone exceeded $4 million in 1949 dollars, equivalent to roughly $52 to $65 million today. To understand how a storm could be so severe, you need to understand what was happening miles above the Great Plains. The jet stream, that river of fast-moving air at high altitude, had positioned itself directly over the central United States. Normally, the jet stream meanders northward and southward at a moderate pace, but occasionally it forms a blocking pattern where the jet stream almost stops moving eastward. It forms a deep north-south trough, like a frozen wave. This was exactly what was happening on January 2, 1949. The jet stream had formed a deep trough with extremely cold air to the north and relatively warm air to the south. A low-pressure system had been channeled into this trough. As it entered the region, it intensified rapidly. Fast pressure drops create faster winds. The faster the pressure drops, the more intense the storm. This system was dropping its central pressure by nearly 1.5 inches in less than 12 hours. Simultaneously, the jet stream directed cold Arctic air southward along the western side of the low-pressure system. The coldest air is found on the west side of a rapidly intensifying storm. The jet stream channeled that Arctic cold directly into the system's path. The storm wasn't moving. It was moving very slowly at 10 to 15 miles per hour instead of typical 20 to 35. That meant locations were getting 36 hours of continuous winter weather, not 12. But here's the key. None of this was predictable with 1949 technology. The U.S. Weather Bureau relied on surface observations, upper air balloons, and primitive weather radar. Upper air data was collected at only 4 release times daily. By the time the morning data was analyzed, the storm was already becoming intense. This limitation would drive transformation of weather forecasting in the coming decade. On January 3rd, as severity became clear, emergency responses began. The National Guard was mobilized in 4 states. Governor Val Peterson of Nebraska authorized 500 guardsmen with snowplow trucks. Wyoming and Colorado mobilized as well. The Army Signal Corps began working on telecommunications restoration. But response was hampered by impassable roads. The first snowplow clearing US-34 didn't arrive until January 4th, over 36 hours after peak storm. Full clearance wasn't achieved until January 6th. The 200 to 300 stranded motorists suffered in their vehicles. Some shut down engines to conserve fuel, meaning no heat. Bob Castillo was rescued on January 4th, approximately 36 hours after his car stopped. A National Guard truck found him barely conscious, suffering severe hypothermia. His feet were frostbitten. He would lose 2 toes. He would walk with a limp for life. Tom Westbrook spent January 3rd and 4th in his barn. On January 5th, a National Guard unit clearing the main access road arrived. He heard the snowplow, a sound like salvation. He dug his way out and reached the road where a truck waited to take him to town. Sarah Kalinsky's isolation lasted only until January 5th, but she and her grandchildren had burned through nearly all readily available firewood. If the storm had lasted 4 more days, they would have been in serious trouble. And that's when the letters started arriving at the governor's offices. By end of January 1949, the full scope was clear. Deaths numbered between 100 and 150 across the affected region. Livestock losses exceeded several hundred thousand animals. Economic losses totaled between $20 and $30 million in 1949, equivalent to roughly $260 to $390 million today. People demanded change. Letters flooded into governors' offices. Farmers demanded better forecasting. Highway departments demanded better communication systems. The National Weather Bureau faced criticism for not issuing more urgent warnings earlier. Governor Val Peterson testified before Congress in February 1949, outlining failures and calling for federal investment in weather forecasting infrastructure. He called for more frequent upper-air observations, a network of weather radar stations, better coordination between the Weather Bureau and state emergency management, and improved communication systems for rural areas. Congress listened. The Weather Bureau's fiscal year 1950 budget was increased by 35% to $35 million. Much funding was directed toward the Great Plains region. New radio sonde stations were established. A weather radar expansion program began. Communication systems were upgraded. Tom Westbrook became an advocate for better farm-to-market road maintenance and emergency communication systems. He gave talks at agricultural extension services about winter preparedness. Bob Castillo's experience became a cautionary tale. His story was retold in local newspapers as a warning about winter travel dangers. He never drove across the Great Plains in winter again. Earl Henderson eventually sold his gas station to a larger company and spent his final working years running a hardware store. The 1949 blizzard became a watershed moment in American meteorology. Universities began dedicating research to rapid intensification. The Weather Bureau established a research division focused on Great Plains severe winter weather. By the early 1950s, understanding of how storm systems rapidly intensified had advanced dramatically. Weather radar was deployed across the Great Plains. By 1955, the National Weather Service had radar stations in Omaha, Denver, Cheyenne, and Pierre. These couldn't predict storms hours in advance, but they could detect them in real time and allow immediate warnings. The highway system was transformed. The interstate highway system incorporated winter weather considerations from the start. Emergency shoulder widths increased. Lighting was installed at regular intervals. By the 1960s, Interstate 80 and I-90 had emergency facilities positioned every 5 to 10 miles specifically to provide refuge for stranded motorists. Agricultural practices evolved. Farmers invested in better barn structures, improved shelter systems, and emergency feed storage protocols. The USDA established educational programs on winter preparedness. But the most important change was invisible. It was in the minds of the people. Winter was no longer just a seasonal inconvenience. It was a force to be honored and feared. The 1949 blizzard became a historical marker. When people talked about other severe storms, they referenced 1949. Not as bad as 49, they would say. The storm became the standard against which all future Great Plains blizzards were measured. The 1949 blizzard directly led to increased investment in the U.S. Weather Bureau, with budget increases of 35% for fiscal year 1950. This funding enabled more frequent radiosonde balloon releases, establishment of new upper-air observation stations across the Great Plains, and the beginning of a comprehensive weather radar network. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1950 included provisions for snow removal equipment and emergency rest areas. The U.S. Weather Service's ability to detect and warn of severe weather in real time improved dramatically. Emergency communication systems evolved. Agricultural preparedness programs were established by the USDA Extension Service. Communities embedded a healthy respect for winter weather in their culture, a respect that persists to this day.